Hey folks, back here with something a little different than the norm this time. What you're looking at here is the NuXT version 2, which is a brand new Turbo XT motherboard. And the idea being that rather than trying to scrounge up parts for an old PC, because honestly, I don't really have any retro PC stuff. I've got all my 8 and 16-bit machines, but I don't have any old PCs. And the idea of being able to cover some old DOS games on the channel here and there actually is appealing. So I originally saw the version 1 of this board, a video LGR did quite some time ago, and I thought that was actually really cool, but I didn't quite have the money at the time to get one of those first run boards. And they sold out fairly quickly, which isn't really a surprise. But after a fair few months waiting, version 2 board is here. I ordered it when it was announced back in April. And it arrived fairly promptly. Monotech, the creators of this, are based in New Zealand, so it was pretty fast to ship here, despite all the circumstances. But I've really had this, I've just been too busy with work and other videos to really not have a chance until now to actually put it together. So the basic overview of what this is it's a board that builds a Turbo XT, which is basically, a faster version of the original IBM PC XT, which is still 4.77 megahertz 8088 processor. This has got full 640K RAM. It's got an integrated VGA card. It's also got an integrated XT IDE, which you can sort of see, I think, down the back there. Probably not through the anti-static back, but and it comes with a 64 meg compact flash card. It uses PS2 ports for keyboard and mouse. It's the most important thing though is that it's a micro ATX board, which means that you could fit it in a modern PC case, which is actually what I've got just out of shot here. Unfortunately, you can't really see it at the moment, but we've got that, and it also uses an ATX power supply, which means that you can use modern parts to run it. And that is kind of really attractive in the sense that when you think about it, as someone who's not really a hardware repair guy, I'll admit that's a very big detriment to me. I am a software guy, so I could examine the software and stuff. But if something were to go wrong on requires desoldering or major repair work, that's out of my league, quite frankly. And so this being a modern system is really cool to do that, and it's got everything integrated. It's also got IDE ports and floppy ports and all of that stuff. So what I want to do in this video is really do a build of it, assemble it, set it up. Then I'm going to just fire it up, play a few games, and see what the experience is like. I've never really used... back in the day, I had friends with older PCs, but when my own experience with the PC as a gaming platform was really in that early to mid-90s 486 era, where VGA was the standard. Sound blasters were a thing, and, they were fast machines that really... You could really specialize with 3D and other things like that. So like I've said, the first part we're going to do is do a walkthrough of just the build. I'm probably going to speed that up, and I'll talk a bit more about bits and pieces as I go through. Then I'm going to set it up, run a few games, and just talk about how it goes out there in terms of, reflect the process. I hope you find it interesting. I'm really looking forward to doing this. I actually haven't built a PC in about 16 years. The last one I built was my last desktop, which is an old Pentium 4 desktop I built in 2004. I've been mainly a laptop user in upgrades since then until I got a PC, which was acquired when my employer was bought out. So I've done a few upgrades to that, basically swapping out disk drives, but I haven't really done a major upgrade to that. I very much, it's going to be an interesting video. So I hope you enjoy this. And now I'm gonna flip the camera position around and get started on actually doing the assembly. So let's sit back and enjoy. Kicking off the build, and the first piece of the puzzle is the power supply. Whilst a 450 watt unit like this can certainly be considered overkill, for me it offers one benefit, being able to connect cables for devices as required. With the new XT board being fully integrated, there's no need for anything other than the main cable providing power to the motherboard. This might change later on as I expand things, but with the lack of front-facing bays in the case, I'm not sure that there's going to be much changes, at least for the moment. Installing the power supply would take up the majority of the time I spent doing the physical build. Firstly, just getting it in place. as this required the case to be flipped upside down in order to mount it. The second, and far more time-consuming piece, was installing the bracket which held it into the case. From installing the little rubber pieces to then screwing it in place, it took some time to get it in place and line it up and do its job. Though once that was sorted, installing the board itself and hooking up the power and case connectors was quite a doddle. This is of course a benefit of the NuXT being a highly integrated board. Had it been like an original board, there would need to be cards for everything installed. The floppy disk controller, hard disk controller, serial and parallel ports, along with that AdLib clone card. At this point, all that was really left is to connect the power and reset buttons, along with the power and hard disk indicator LEDs. All in all, it's a process which took me quite a few hours, embarrassingly enough, to put it all together. Which of course, most of that was really dealing with getting the power supply sorted, especially because I haven't really built a system like this in quite a long period of time. But then, it's time for the grand powering up. I do love the default chime here. Instead of a solitary beep, it's that Intel advert chime. Which is funny because I've got a v20 CPU installed here, which is alternative to the classic 8088, offering a slightly higher speed as a result. The BIOS setup here isn't quite as elegant as what you get on later systems, but it's easy enough to configure the settings. Your default CPU boot speed, what drives are connected, and everything else. But now with all of those connected, it's time to boot into DOS and finally try out some games. Coming from the backgrounds I know, it really only felt right to check out the DOS version of Stunt Car Racer to see how it fares between the other versions I'm more familiar with. What I found surprising is that even with the machine running at that slow 4.77 MHz, it was quite playable. It ran quite nicely, and when bumping up the speed, it was even smoother. Most importantly, timing was consistent and it felt controllable as before. This one is certainly a showcase for showing how well a tightly coded game can run, especially with keeping timing consistent. Now for another driving game, and the conversion of Outrun offers a bit of a different story. Sadly, EGA isn't an option here, even when set to the fastest system speed. Though, once dropping back to CGA mode, the slower system speed isn't quite enough. Bumping it back up to the faster speed really does help. Outrun now runs at a decent enough frame rate to be controllable and enjoyable. Though this is especially important because, unlike many other home versions, there is some semblance of analog steering controls here, which is fine if you're playing with a joystick, but not so much when on the keyboard. I thought we need to check out something modern next, which is Paku Paku, a more recent DOS game. Regardless of the CPU setting on the system, this one just felt solid to play. It plays a mean maze-munching game, and has great hardware support. This is actually running in VGA, alongside using the AdLib for audio. And another case of good AdLib support is Firehawk Thexter 2, much like many of Sierra's other releases of the time. Again, it's not really a surprise coming from them. Though, on a visual and performance front, it's a little more complex. When running at the slowest speed, it's hard to enjoy it, and part of this really comes from using that high-res EGA mode for simulating the art style. Now, bumping the CPU up to the fastest speed really did help. It made it playable, though obviously not at its optimum speed. Firehawk also includes an MCGA mode, really intended for PS2 systems, and what I found interesting was that whilst I expected it to perform worse than in EGA, it really performed much worse than I had expected. It's certainly not an option to enjoy it here, though honestly I think the colour blending in squeezing it to that lower resolution doesn't quite work as well. There were still some games where things didn't quite feel right at the end, and one of those for me was F-15 Strike Eagle 2. Even dropping the graphics back to using CGA, then bumping the processor speed to using the fastest option available, and then messing about with the detail settings, the performance really was tolerable. And certainly not really what I would have liked. It's just a bit too slow to be enjoyable, but okay enough to be playable. Despite that, what is being shown here, this kind of open 3D environment with some solid detail, is quite amazing. especially when you compare it to other titles around at the time. Finally, and unsurprisingly, is yet another modern release, Planet X3. I guess everyone who is doing a retro PC video has to show it off at some point. Running this in its VGA mode is quite impressive. Even with the system set to its slowest speed, it was playable and quite solid to enjoy. But once you bump it up to that faster speed, you can see how well it's programmed and honestly how much smoother it is to enjoy. Along with that, there is some great support for ad-lib audio here, and of course many other sound devices. All up, it's a really nice experience to sit down and play. And so there we have it. That's just been a bunch of games tested on my NuXT build, and I really enjoyed the process of putting the machine together and trying them out. I'm quite happy with the build so far, and at least in the short term, the next phase for me is really trying to look into getting direct capture working, being able to take that VGA signal and get it through my capture rig so I can do some PC games alongside other content. Other than that, I do really want to get my hands on a joystick card and a joystick. Some of these games are better played with a joystick. In fact, I really found Stunt Car Racer to have a few quirks with its keyboard controls, especially throwing me off compared to the C64 and Amiga versions I'm much more familiar with. I do hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please do give the video a thumbs up and perhaps tell your friends. Word of mouth is especially important for helping this channel grow. Not really seen well in the algorithms, and you know what that means. If you haven't already, do consider subscribing if you're after seeing, more slices of old computing joy and in-depth game examinations as always. Last but not least, I just wanted to say thank you so very much for taking the time out to enjoy this video.